For the whole podcast in English, please fast forward this tiny introduction in Portuguese. As pessoas sempre me perguntam sobre alternativas econômicas para o campo e as pessoas sempre caem naquela discussão de que o Bitcoin gasta muita energia e de que talvez não tenha internet, que talvez não tenha eletricidade. A resposta mais curta para toda essa situação é: eu não tenho informação suficiente, eu tenho buscado me informar e estudar sobre moedas alternativas. O que eu posso dizer é: eu acredito que o campo deva ser encarado também como uma forma de cultivar e preservar dissidência. E nesse sentido, uma moeda que não passa por um banco central é muito importante. Dentro de tudo que eu estudei, eu acabei chegando no Bitcoin Cash, que é uma bifurcação do Bitcoin. Entre as duas opções do Bitcoin e o Bitcoin Cash, o Bitcoin Cash manteve essa função original que tem no artigo do Satoshi Nakamoto, que é a questão de manter uma moeda de troca. Eu percebo que a gente está caminhando muito rapidamente para uma situação de uma economia muito controlada e vejo uma utilidade muito grande numa moeda de pessoa para pessoa que é resistente à censura e que não passa pelo viés do Estado e dos governos que estão, na verdade, a serviço das grandes corporações. Essa foi uma conversa com o Jeremy do Bitcoin Cash. Tiro várias dúvidas, estudo com ele uma pessoa muito bacana, esclareceu muitas dúvidas, me recebeu muito bem dentro da rede de contato dele e tem me ajudado a pensar maneiras de montar economias alternativas para pequenas regiões, biorregiões rurais, usando uma moeda de pessoa para pessoa, que no caso é o Bitcoin Cash. Deixo com vocês o podcast.
All right, folks, I'm here with Jeremy from the Bitcoin Cash side of the fork. I will explain to you what the fork is in a minute. He will do a better job than I can do. Jeremy, thank you very much for your time.
Glad to be here.
Jeremy, I found you actually through a documentary that I think you did the voiceover because it was first recorded in Spanish, wasn't it?
Yes, and I did the English. It was called Who Killed Bitcoin? And it was made by these guys in BCH, Argentina, a great team covering a lot of what is now becoming much more widely known, but at the time was still quite censored and suppressed about what happened with the BTC BCH split, how Bitcoin works, how it was co-opted, all that. It's a really good documentary, and I watched it in Spanish and I was very impressed by it. And then I think I'm not sure whether I reached out to them or they reached out to me, but I was familiar with those guys in BCH Argentina, and they said, "Hey, we want to do an English version. Can you do the voiceover?" And I did. We, translated everything and then recorded over it. Now you can probably do it all with AI, but we had to do it manually. And then, that also brought it to a whole new audience, which was really good. It got played at Porkfest in New Hampshire, and it just has done a lot of good. For the right kind of person, it's the kind of thing that can really click. Maybe you're one of those people.
Well, for me, it was. It's been difficult, to be honest with you. I'm in a journey of learning about the possibilities of using Bitcoin, but since I watched that documentary, it made much more sense to me to use Bitcoin Cash. The reason being, because I like to go for sources. I have an academic background, so I like to check for sources. And when you go down and read, I'm very newbie in all of these things, but when you go down the path of reading the sources, I think the first the white paper was a peer-to-peer currency. That was the main goal of the thing, wasn't it?
Yes, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. That's what Satoshi said, and ultimately that's how it's most effective. There's a lot of nuance to that, but I don't believe that in the long run the current BTC is going to survive or thrive simply because it's fighting against how the system was actually built at the ground level. It's kind of a inversion or a warping of how it should operate. And it's like anything, things are a certain way. Like people are a certain way. They have a certain nature, and a lot of people, myself included, spend a lot of their youth or maybe even their entire lives fighting against the way that they are supposed to be, or wishing they were somebody else, or things have an inherent nature. A hammer is not a screwdriver, right? And some things need to accept who they are to fully become what they were supposed to be. And Bitcoin is no different. But of course, just like people get confused by all kinds of media, outside influences or whatever, and maybe they get on the wrong track until one way or another they're able to find the path that they should be on. Bitcoin has kind of been on a similar journey.
Jeremy, you've been on you're very young still, but you've been in this journey for quite some time now. Would you mind sharing a little bit of your background? How you ended up, well, first, using Bitcoin, and then later on becoming a very one of the greatest advocates for Bitcoin Cash.
Yes.
We can define what it is later, but what about you? Like how did it all happen?
How much detail do you want? Do you want the short, medium, or long version?
Man, feel free. You choose. I'm just curious about. I think it bears importance for people to understand how different people decide to jump into using a digital money, because it's scary for most people, even though fiat money is bullshit.
Digital, yeah.
But anyway, people were convinced that it was safer. So it's quite a big leap of faith to go to a different currency. So it takes different events, different people, different circumstances. So pick it. It's up to you how far you want to go.
Yes. Well, so I'm Australian. I was born and raised in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. A very small place. Now it's grown a little bit, but it was about 250,000 people. And there's two very important things about that. One is that unlike most capital cities, which are sort of organic, it was where there was a river or an old city developed, and then it became a center of commerce, and then it becomes the largest and most important city. In Australia, Canberra is artificial. It was created on the route between Sydney and Melbourne because the two largest colonies from the British were not able to agree. Sydney was kind of the economic center and Melbourne was the cultural capital, and they disagreed. And so they eventually said, look, let's just create a new city in the middle, which is quite unusual. I don't know of any other country that is like that, but I was born and raised there. Yeah.
Let me just share with you something then. I was born and raised in Brasilia. Brasilia is the artificial capital of Brazil and was placed right in the middle for similar reasons. It was built up from the 60s onwards.
There you go. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that. I'll need to look into that. But the 60s, that's even younger than Canberra. Canberra will be there 1915. But in any case, Canberra's a very small place. And so the majority of the workforce is actually either directly involved with the government or is contracting the government. So over 50% of the adults in Canberra either work for the government or are directly affiliated in it in some way. So I grew up in possibly one of the most, government thinking places in the world, probably even compared to other capitals. The concentration of reliance on government is enormous. And then secondly, Australia is obviously a very rich country. It's got a very high standard of living, and that's a good thing, of course, but it also makes people quite complacent. People there are very compliant and they don't have a very strong sense of fighting against the system or anything. Like Australia has never had a war fought on its shores. It's never had either a civil war. It's never even had a foreign war. It was involved in World War I, World War II, but that was all overseas, right? So Australia is kind of like an insulated little bubble, and the people there are very accepting of the way things are. So I kind of grew up in that environment, but I was never, it's like we were talking about before, it's in some people's nature. It was never in my nature to be, compliant or following the way a crowd thinks. I guess I was always quite independent. So when I was when I was maybe 13 or 14, and there was the 2008 financial crisis, right? There was a whole meltdown and everything, in the whole world economy. And I was super interested in that because I was seeing it every day in the newspaper, the stock market's melting down and big problems in the world economy. but I didn't really understand it because I was looking around and nothing had changed in my life. You know, of course, some people in Australia were affected, but as a combination of my family circumstances and Australia's circumstances, I was quite insulated. So I saw all this chaos and problems, but to me, nothing had really changed. And I was always fascinated by, you know, the stock market pages that were at the back of the magazine, because there was a stock market and then there was the sports section, and Australians love sports. So that was a big section, lots of pictures and things. But the stock market was very small and boring. But I found it very interesting because it was clearly a combination of mathematics and logic, which I'm quite interested in, and also psychology. You know, the way people move in crowds and herd psychology, I guess. So I was very interested in all of that, and I always found it quite interesting, the interest rates that were set by the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and also, of course, the US Federal Reserve, because I thought, how did they know what was the perfect interest rate to set? It's like a council of 10 or 12 guys or whatever, and they pick a number. And I thought, how do they come up with that number? These guys in America, they have no idea what I'm buying for lunch. So how would they know what was the perfect? They don't know if I'm buying, you know, a hamburger or I'm buying fish and chips. They don't know. So how would they know? And that's just me, let alone billions of people in the world. So who are these people who have the mystical, wizardly knowledge to know the perfect number? So I was kind of quite interested in economics from a very young age and suspicious of that central control. Now, when I was about 17, I think, I had a friend who, similar to me, was also quite a sort of open-minded, interesting kind of guy. And he, one day, we were hanging out at his house in his bedroom. I remember he said to me, he said, Jeremy, the price of Bitcoin just crashed. And I said, why'd it crash? I didn't even ask what it was. What is Bitcoin? I didn't care. I just said, why'd it crash? And he said, the Silk Road drug market got taken down. So, and I said, great, let's buy some. Because I instantly just thought, well, that's an opportunity. If the price of something crashes because of something like a website going down, someone will put up another website and the price will go back up. You know, it was obvious to me as a temporary, you know, mania or fluctuation in the market. So then I had it in the back of my mind. And about 2 months later, when I got the time, I sat down and I looked up the Bitcoin white paper. I Googled it and I read the white paper. And I instantly was like, this is going to be the future. This is going to take over. It's going to be the global reserve currency. It's going to just subsume all other economic activity. I guess because maybe I had an intuitive sense of sort of economics, like I said, and I was already able to program, you know, I was already a software web developer. So I understood the technical aspect. So I knew that it could work technically, it would hold together. And I knew economically that it made sense to have a fixed supply and to not have the government, you know, manipulating it. It would be more efficient, right? And then I guess culturally as well, it also made sense to me that between the economics and the technology, it would overrule the sort of hesitation that people would have around that kind of thing, given enough time. So then I spent about 2 days thinking what could stop it. I thought, well, what could stop this kind of thing from taking over completely? And I eventually concluded that nothing could, because if something did happen that went wrong, since it's an open source software project, somebody could simply just create a fork of it and carry it on. So it would just be self-healing. It would be anti-fragile, as they say. So at that point, I became very excited about Bitcoin. And I told my parents that I wanted to sell my share portfolio and put my money into Bitcoin. And because I was still underage, I wasn't 18 years old yet. So they had to, you know, sign off. They had the parental controls on it. And they said, oh, you're getting scammed. Like, this is a complete scam. What are you getting involved? Some internet like Ponzi or something like that. So I had to wait a couple months, but eventually I got the money and then I bought some Bitcoin. And then I became, you know, obsessed with it. I read all about it. And then, you know, it's a long story, but if we just yeah, go on.
No, just a little parenthesis there. What do they think now, your parents?
You know, it's funny. They still kind of don't really get it, you know? Like, I was talking to my mum last year, and she was asking me a little bit about Bitcoin everything like that. And I made some points and she was like arguing with me. She asked a question, I gave her an answer. And instead of saying, that's probably a good point, or let me think about that, she said, no, that can't work because this or that. And I had to say to her, Mum, 11 years ago, you told me that this was a Ponzi scheme and I was going to lose all my money. 11 years later, here we are. It's this global phenomenon with millions of people involved. The price has increased, 100x. And everything, like, when are you going to realize that I'm onto something? Like, you need to actually listen to me and stop arguing with me about this. But, that did shut her up, actually. So
it's one of those phenomenon which we sort of explain it to the Max Planck principle, isn't it? He used to say, like, he said this much more eloquently, but it was summarized by, the adoption of Bitcoin. Of course, I'm adapting the phrase here, but the adoption of Bitcoin proceeds one funeral at a time.
Yes, exactly. People don't change their mind; they just die. That's how I like to think of it. So.
I would like to think that people change their minds, because we need a lot of people changing their minds for us to be able to fix a few of the main challenges we have today. It's an interesting story. I'm just sort of still studying and trying things out, and my main interest with this, like I told you, is because I believe we will need alternative currencies to circumvent oppression. I can see that. That's one of the reasons why Argentina is such a great laboratory for Bitcoin, because they've been smashed and crashed, like, in cycles for the past, 40, 60 years or something.
Indeed, BCH has a very strong hub in Argentina. Bitcoin generally, but particularly BCH, which is quite telling. And I haven't been to Argentina or Brazil. I would like to go. It's on my to-do list, but I just haven't found the right occasion for it. But I do already have quite a lot of friends there, and I would love to go. I love South America, actually. Yeah.
Like you said, it's telling because I think we can go down this path now, but it's telling because they need a currency that holds value. It's one of the main things. One of the main problems that they have is that, every now and then their currency is smashed, and I find it funny because we all have our biases, and now we are so divided that people get caught up in biases instead of looking for the truth, and then they sort of develop attachment to their biases, and it becomes really difficult to discuss things. But I'm just prefacing, because I don't think Milei is doing a good job. Some people do, but in many ways, the chaotic situation that the country was put in is making lots of poor people suffer. And I think we need to stop looking at economies from the perspective of the bankers and rich people, because when they say the economy is going good, it's going good for them. It's not going good for everyone. And it's telling because they are now switching to Bitcoin Cash over actually holding dollars, which is a pretty strong statement, isn't it?
Well, yes, I hope so. I mean, as far as I'm aware, of course, dollarization is still absolutely rampant there. People still, treat it as a staple thing, because in comparison to what they're used to, it is still relatively a large upgrade. But of course, they're still very open-minded. That's something that Argentinians are very, very good about. They have a very high suspicion of government, and they're also quite curious. Once you start talking to them about new ideas, different countries, obviously every individual is different and every country is different. But on average, I've found Argentinians have a very curious, inquisitive mind. And so something like Bitcoin is also predisposed to them, because they can understand that things don't have to operate according to the rules as they know them, because they're so used to just operating around the government rules that don't make sense, or having to sort of look out for themselves and their local communities. That's very inbuilt into their culture.
We have very different sizes of economy between Brazil and Argentina. We are a little bit like Aussies and Kiwis. We like to make jokes
Yes.
about each other. But even so, we went to a few episodes in our separate histories that are quite similar. Argentina had a major crash in 2000, but about 8 years before that, we had one of the youngest presidents in Brazil. He's been charged with many things now. Like I don't think he was honest, but anyway, at the time he came up with a plan, and he froze everyone's account overnight without telling anyone. Like we had an increase in rates of suicide, and it was tough. A lot of people went bankrupt, and it didn't fix anything. So he leveled the ground. I'm butchering the policy here, but forgive my summary. But he was trying to level the ground because we've come from a rampant increase in inflation. And I find it funny that Brazil and Argentina have been trying to deal with this in different ways. And Argentina adopted the dollar. At least many times they did this non-officially. Brazil never did that because we have a larger economy. It doesn't make international and geopolitical sense. But the truth is, the money, even today, one Brazilian real is worth it 5 times less than a dollar. And to have such a difference between currencies that are fake anyway, it just boggles my mind. It's all fake.
It's all fake. Yeah, of course. That's why, economics is really kind of a branch of psychology. People want what they want, and the economics is what they will actually pay for, what they'll put skin in the game. And then, of course, the smartest people figured out that if you could commit, it's like Monopoly, I don't know if you played Monopoly as a kid. I played Monopoly a lot as a kid, but that's often a good way to explain to people, like, what is the point of Bitcoin? You say to them, you play Monopoly, right? And they say yes. And you say, okay, somebody is the banker, and they say yes. And you say, so if you were playing against the person who was the banker, and if they could just endlessly draw from the bank, of course, in Monopoly, there's rules. The banker still has to accord to certain rules. But if you said to them, okay, imagine that you were playing Monopoly, but the person who is the banker could literally just always take money out of the bank. There was no conditions on that. Would you ever be able to win? And they would say, no, of course not. And you say, well, that's how the real world works. What is these pieces of paper? It's the same. It's literally colored squares of paper. Have you ever thought who gives you those, or where they get them from? Where is the rules stopping them from just printing endlessly amounts of that for themselves and their mates? And then that's kind of like maybe the light goes on a little bit there, right? Why is it that every video game and everything, they never have a fiat currency? They always use gold, right? Fantasy video games, science fiction video games, there's some kind of gold system or universal credits. It's never like fiat currency unless it's basically
or spice.
Yeah, exactly. It's some kind of universal organic resource. Exactly. He who controls the spice, controls everything, right?
I want to ask you to contextualize what Bitcoin is, the difference between, Bitcoin as a currency and fiat. But I just want to share an interesting thing. I follow not that close, but quite closely the work of Yanis Varoufakis. Do you know him?
I feel like I've heard of it. Yeah, he's like a Bulgar. Right? He's like, I don't know, in his 50s or 60s, something like that. Yeah. Yeah,
so he's a Greek guy. He used to live in Sydney. I think he's done his PhD at Sydney University, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, he was in Sydney as an academic. So game theory, in a doctorate in economics and that sort of stuff. He was drawn back to Greece, and he was their finance ministry during the 2008 crisis.
That's where I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah. So and they were trying to force austerity policies, and he shares in his book that he went to meetings with the bankers, and for the media they said one thing, but in closed doors was something else. They were sort of imposing a lot of non-reasonable to say the least, measures onto Greece. Now, it's interesting that he's a very strong leadership in the left-wing thinking. And then recently, someone asked him about Bitcoin on a podcast, and I found it interesting because he said he was telling a story that when he first heard about Bitcoin, and then someone asked him, what about Bitcoin? And then he said, well, it's a great invention for a problem we do not yet have. Now, it's symptomatic, it's telling, because he said this roughly at the same historical time that Assange had to go to Bitcoin because all the banks, international banks in every country denied him and WikiLeaks the chance of trading, of using money. And I find terrifying that a leader of the left, it doesn't matter which side, but it's terrifying that the guy can't see the value of something that saved one of the greatest activists of our time. He couldn't see the value. So it's a great invention for a problem we do not have yet. I think within 12 months, WikiLeaks was saved using like a very young and non-stable Bitcoin. And that kept them afloat for years before he was actually caught, and then all the Assange thing developed. So that's my interest. Like we need to be able to exchange without intervention, because whoever is in government might change, the agenda might change, but one thing keeps constant, which is they all want to keep the population quiet, subdued, and powerless. So that's my intellectual interest in the money that's not tied to anything real, but might be used in very real ways. So let's go this way. What is Bitcoin, and why Bitcoin?
Yes, so Bitcoin, as it says in the title of the white paper, which I recommend everybody can read. It's a technical document. It's about 9 pages, but at least the first page, everyone will be able to understand. And then the rest of it, maybe there's some bits you don't get, but the concept is very simple and very easy to understand. So everybody can read it there. It's Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And the abstract and the introduction basically explains that to make payments on the internet, you need to have a third-party provider, or you did anyway, because I can't just send money to you for a couple of reasons. But the one reason is that if you fraud me, I'm going to be screwed, right? I need somebody to complain to. So then you have a bank, you have PayPal, now you have Venmo, you have all these services sitting in the middle, because there might be the possibility for fraud, and also the costs were high. I mean, Bitcoin was invented in 2008, or the white paper was published in 2008. And at that time, things on the internet were still much more expensive to do than they are now. The internet wasn't so developed, and there hadn't been so much infrastructure around it, of course, right? So the concept was for an internet native currency that operates outside of a middleman. No government, no bank, no corporation, no political regime, just a neutral money that would let people transact peer-to-peer without a middleman. And the method for doing that required creating digital scarcity, right? Up until Bitcoin, there was no such thing as a scarce digital object. If I have a photo or a file on my computer, I could copy it and send it to you, and anybody can do that. So that makes a system of money unviable, because anybody can print an endless amount. And just like we see with inflation in fiat currencies, if everyone can print an endless amount, eventually they will, and then the whole thing will become worthless, right? Scarcity or value requires scarcity, because demand is not infinite, right? So that was the concept of Bitcoin. So the solution that Satoshi published in the white paper essentially has two main components. One, which is how do you avoid having a central party, which is that the central party, like a bank or whatever, what they do is they provide a ledger, like an Excel spreadsheet of Jeremy has this much money and James has this much money and Sally has this much money. And so Satoshi said, okay, well, to avoid anyone being able to control the ledger, we'll give the ledger to everyone. So if people are familiar with things like BitTorrent or file sharing networks, that's the peer-to-peer part. We'll just we'll make the ledger open source and transparent. And so everyone can have a copy and everyone can check each other's work. And then the sort of secret ingredient that he mixed in there to make it so that you couldn't just copy and paste this everywhere was what's called proof of work, which is basically the idea that you would have to run your computer pulling lottery tickets, essentially mathematical lottery tickets, until you hit on something, a special number to verify your ledger of transactions. So the function of that is essentially that you're burning electricity to stake your claim onto the copy of the ledger. So in that way, anybody can make a copy, but only one person will have the copy with the most amount of electricity burnt, backing it up essentially. So it's like it's called proof of work, where essentially you're proving that you have skin in the game, and that's what's called Bitcoin miners, and that's why everybody got very excited about the idea that they could just run their home laptop and make millions on Bitcoin, which is now not viable. It hasn't been viable for many years, but the concept is still there. All the energy that is burnt behind Bitcoin. Sometimes people think, why are we quote unquote wasting all this money on electricity for Bitcoin? But it's actually an essential part of the recipe, because it's the only way that you can prove energy is kind of like nature's universal currency, right? It's the only way you can prove unfakeably to everyone else that you are very invested in something, is putting a lot of energy into it. So that's the concept, a neutral, open currency backed by the expenditure of energy, which everyone in the world is open to use and doesn't have any middlemen, which means it has no political bias, and at least in theory, it can be very, very efficient.
It's a fascinating approach to, and it's a fascinating approach in a form of liberation. I want to point a few things out. Please correct me, challenge, and ask questions if you want to. I'm very curious about this. So I have a few questions, and I think people need to understand better what it is. So it's a public ledger. We're talking about a peer-to-peer currency that allows people to become or to privately transact. That's another thing as well. People are not discussing with the proper gravity of the situation the fact that governments want to have a digital currency as well, but theirs will be a way of surveilling people. It's a surveillance. How do you pronounce that? Surveillance. It's a surveillance tool, isn't it? Because CBDCs, the government will know everything you do, everything you buy. And people are not discussing that. But it's only in recent history that money became something that can be somehow scrutinized, because people wouldn't share how much money they had, and it was a tool for private transactions, and it's being subverted by governments as a tool of control. So, in saying that, my first question is: isn't this ledger a risk, a liability for people in terms of privacy?
Yes.
I really don't know.
Yes, there's two sides to it. It's a nuanced thing. So the first thing is that people got this strong impression or misconception created mostly by the media that Bitcoin was this scary anonymous online thing, right? That you can transact anonymously, it's used for drug deals and etc. Right? That's basically using fear to manipulate the population, because of course drug dealers use money, drug dealers use the internet, drug dealers use running water. Tools that are useful are used by everyone. It doesn't matter whether you're a criminal or the most upstanding person on the planet. Useful things are useful and everyone is going to use them, right? But there was also a bit of a misconception that was widely spread about that Bitcoin was anonymous, that nothing could ever be traced. But the exact opposite is the truth. Every single Bitcoin transaction is made publicly. Now, that was the only way that we found to have a solution to this kind of uncontrolled, money. So it's a bit of a trade-off. That said, when the records are put on the blockchain, they are just cryptographic strings. If I generate a new Bitcoin address and I give it to you and you send me money, it's only you and me that know we were involved in that transaction, unless we tell somebody, or unless you post it online, or unless the government is surveilling your phone or something, right? And then they know that it's you. So their Bitcoin actually has very high potential for privacy, but how private it is in practice depends on how aware you are about using it. Now, there's also further, developments to that story, because, for instance, you could do like coin mixing. So even if the ledger is public and somebody knows, okay, this is your address, there are services and products which let you do, like if we went to a group meeting and everybody had $10 in cash and we all put $10 into a hat and then mixed it around and then we all pulled out $10. Well, now nobody knows who has which $10, right? You can do things like that with Bitcoin. And also specific to BCH, all the scripting upgrades this is jumping ahead a lot, but all the upgrades that have been made recently give it the potential for doing that kind of thing in a cryptographically secure way. So it will be possible to have, or it already is possible, it just hasn't been built out yet, to have cryptographically verifiable, supply and transactions without people being able to necessarily link individual identities to specific transactions. Like if you've heard of Monero or Zcash, there's a whole slew of these so-called privacy coins that have various technologies around helping create privacy in the money. And BCH is eventually going to adopt, copy, or even improve on all of those things so that you can have a transparent ledger, but also maintain strong privacy.
Jeremy, I want to preemptively make an argument for a peer-to-peer way of transacting, which is, like you said, media, governments, authorities, they always use fear. Oh, this is used by, fraudulent people, bad guys, unethical people, whatever. Now, it has never prevented rich people from scamming poor people before. The fiat money, that's what it is. It's a scam. Population is screwed, and inflation eats away the value of the money. We can never work fast enough, hard enough to reestablish value for the currency we use. And that's not said, of course, because all of the articles, not all of them, but most of the articles and approaches come from mainstream media, which is of course biased towards government authority, not for the sake of government or democracy, but because corporations use government to make money. So down the road, what really means is they're defending corporations when they're saying they're defending democracy, because I don't know whether you stand with us, but anyway, I don't think it's a democracy anymore. The governments are just used by corporations. Corporations are much larger than governments. Governments cannot provide what was meant to provide, which is the public sector of services that should be kept free, because if they're profitable, they put people run the risk of going unethical roads with it. So I want to just empty this argument, because we should have the privacy of transacting without having government oversight. I don't think it. Yeah. And I don't care which side of the political spectrum a person is. If you're arguing for the centralization of power and money, there will never be a true democracy.
Yeah, of course, government. Yeah, like money is just the right of speech, right? All democracies or various countries need to preserve a right to speech. You need to have a right to assemble and a right to speak, because if you can't speak, then how, the people in power can by default define the limits of what it's allowed to say, and therefore they can control a society. So you need to have a political commitment to the concept that people can have ideas which fall outside the Overton window of acceptable discourse, because it's those people at the fringes who might have a good point if the system is becoming too authoritarian or too imbalanced in a certain way, that then what later becomes acceptable was unacceptable at the time that it was done. And that's the exact same thing with money. If you don't have the right to own your own money and spend your own money and transact with who you want to transact with, then it's the exact same thing. Your whole society is going to end up captured by powers that can't be challenged if people are not able to assemble and not able to coordinate economically to resist that, right? So it's the exact same thing. Money is just a form of speech, especially in the case of Bitcoin, because it literally is just ones and zeros. It's just information. I could tell you a Bitcoin transaction. It would take a little while, but we could literally talk it out right here, and I could send a Bitcoin transaction to you just by speaking about it. So if you can't speak, you can't transact Bitcoin. If you can't transact Bitcoin or money in general, then you can't resist an oppressive regime.
You gave me a few things to go on. I just want to make an example again. It doesn't matter which side of the spectrum the audience will be, but a few years ago in Canada, we had the truckers movement against the vaccine passport. Without going the path of discussing pharmaceuticals and all that, what I want to say is this: without any due process, without any oversight from the main powers in a democracy, you have the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary. Now they overrule all of these, and they froze everyone's account. So it makes sense what you're saying, because what they did was to silence them through money. It wasn't in Ghana, it wasn't in Brazil, it wasn't in Panama, it was in Canada. One of the main Western countries, part of the Five Eyes, all that. Now, and people still can't understand the value of having, a private form of currency. So you're talking about Bitcoin, and you said Bitcoin is a form no, you said money is a form of speech. That's one thing.
Yes.
And you also said money is a form of energy. Actually, money represents energy. Energy is defined in physics as the capacity to do work. And this brings us to an amalgamation of questions, which is, if money is a token for energy, energy is the capacity to do work, we are rapidly exhausting our natural resources. That means that BTC or BCH, for that matter, cannot hold the value that they currently have. You cannot, even with scarcity, you cannot materialize $100,000 worth of labor or work in a world that will have less and less oil to do that. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a great book. I'm just trying to remember what it's called, but I think it's called The Infinite Resource. And it's the idea that resources are not limited. Resources are actually infinite. Why? Because what is a resource depends on what you're using and how you're using it with technology. So for instance, the cavemen, they were walking around trying to figure out enough sticks to build a house. And to them, a puddle of oil was not a resource. Actually, it was just really annoying. It was just this gunk that got in the way and screwed up everything you were trying to do, because at the time they didn't have the technology or the understanding to, harvest and capture that and use it to create energy, right? So the actual resource that we have in the world is ideas. Like, for instance, we didn't have Bitcoin until we did have Bitcoin. And then there's all this economic growth that has happened within Bitcoin. The same with large language models, right? AI is the current thing that's kicking off. Like, that's just an idea. It's just a fundamental new way of arranging bits in a computer or information in an informational system, and that's created a whole new amount of the economy, right? The world is not a limited amount of resources. Physically it is, but the way that those can be applied or adapted is infinite, according, as with human ingenuity. And the same thing like asteroids, right now we just consider those rocks that are just swirling around in space, but once we have the right technology, we'll be able to get up there and harvest those things, and then suddenly we have a whole new pool of resources that we've discovered, right? So I don't think there's really a limit on resources. That would be like misunderstanding economics or technology in my mind.
Yeah, we go different ways in this issue, I think, but I still think even if we can't hold this sort of value for Bitcoin, I think it's still very useful because of the privacy it gives to users as a peer-to-peer currency. So, money can be used as a form of speech, like you said. In the case of digital money, it is a form of information. How it will replace... Okay, we're talking about BTC before. So BTC was, invented by this guy, Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah.
We don't know whether it was a person, a group of people. It doesn't matter. It's working. Its use is been increasing, and then we came to a situation which is what brought me to you was that documentary. Like, people start disagreeing with the direction that it was going. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes. So it's a big topic, but to cut it down, to size as much as it can, the way I like to explain this to people is like religion, right? People are familiar with the concept of, Christianity and Islam and Judaism being branches of the same thing, right? They started out as one thing. Along the way, some people had a disagreement, they were going this way. Some people had a disagreement, they were going that way. And then they split off. And then over time, those communities started talking to each other, and they increasingly became different, but they still share the same origin. And then you have that splinters down further, right? There's like Sunni and Shiite Muslims, there's, Protestant and Catholic and all these different, forms of Christianity as well too. And so if you look from the outside, you might think, okay, Christianity is Christianity, and you just lump it all into one box. Or maybe monotheism is just monotheism, you lump it all into one box. But once you get into the details, you start seeing these little sectors emerge that all have their differences over things that maybe from the outside seem arcane or pointless or whatever. But the more you get into the details, the more specific, and the more you care about those specific things. So Bitcoin, like I said, is about having a universal currency system that, in theory, everyone in the world could use the same currency, right? Because that would be the most efficient and the most effective. Now, when Bitcoin was conceived, the concept was that it would become that 8 billion people would be all able to transact all in Bitcoin, and that would maximize the network effect. And it would also provide enough economic activity to sustain the electricity, which touches on what we were talking about before. Now, what happened was, through a long series of sort of misdemeanors and different elements, in my mind, things were deliberately sabotaged to stop it going down that point, because, like we said, governments maybe are not too keen to have people with such an alternative available to them, but they couldn't directly attack it, right? Bitcoin has no headquarters, it has no CEO, you can't just switch it off, it's too distributed, it's too hard to attack that way. So there was like, yeah, go on.
Pardon. And the documentary doesn't state that literally, but it insinuates that, the Bitcoin space was actually infiltrated, and it's a very good point. Like that documentary is very well put together.
Yes, I would recommend Who Killed Bitcoin, of course, in either English or Spanish, wherever whatever is best for your listeners, and also the book Hijacking Bitcoin by Roger Ver and Steve Patterson. It's sort of mostly the same ideas, but presented in a different format, and people might get it more easily in one format or the other. But it basically documents the concept that the Bitcoin community was infiltrated, and the concept of a global peer-to-peer electronic cash system was subverted. Now, the Bitcoin community at the time realized that this was happening. I was part of the Bitcoin community in this era, which is now infamous, between 2015 and 2017, called the block size wars, where basically Bitcoin had its first civil war. And I think that is really the metaphor for it. Nobody was shot. No, there was no physical violence, which is very in keeping with the Bitcoin cryptographic, peaceful anti-government philosophy. But the community came to a head over the direction that the project should go, because ultimately you have to make a decision with your technical choices. Are we going to do things this way or that way, right? Now, in my mind, that was largely fermented deliberately by a number of misconceptions and propaganda that was implanted into the community. And there was famous instances of censorship, which were stamping down on very notably one side of ideas, but not the other. So to my mind, that was malicious. But even if you're taking a more favorable reading of it, you could just say, well, humans are always going to differ, right? There's a right and a left wing politically. There's libertarians and there's authoritarians, right? Doesn't matter. There's different sports teams. There's Diet Coke and Pepsi, right? People always have a need to go into groups. It doesn't matter what it is. So maybe, if you're being charitable, you could say maybe that's just what happened. So the Bitcoin community got into this civil war, and there was roughly two sides of opinion about it. One was called the big blockers, which is the side that I was on, which was the idea that Satoshi had explained this currency, and the way that it functioned was that as you get more people onto the network, you increase the capacity of the network, essentially. Like I said, it's a ledger, which you can think of like a book. As you get more people joining the network, you add more pages to the book. And that was an obvious thing to do, because a currency is more useful the more people that you have involved with it. It's also an obvious thing to do because technology improves. At the time in 2008, when it started, Bitcoin had these 1 megabyte blocks. And that was, relative to the hardware available now. But now megabytes is nothing. Now people have gigabyte hard drives. Actually, they have petabyte hard drive, terabyte hard drives. And soon, there's already petabyte hard drives. They're a little bit expensive now, but in 10 years, they'll be cheap, right? So technology is constantly improving, which would by default allow the capacity of Bitcoin to expand without getting more expensive, right? That was generally the big blocker thinking. Now, the other side was the small blockers, who instead they had a concept. I mean, it's always hard for me to give a charitable version of their side of things, but their idea was that the value in Bitcoin was its resiliency, right? That it should not be threatened, the ability for kind of, in their mind, developers to control it or for it to get more expensive. They think that the ability to run nodes and store copies of the ledger is the most important thing, because if the government was trying to stamp out Bitcoin, they would have to go to all these individual copies and try and shut them off one by one. So they wanted to maximize the number of people with those copies, even if it meant that less people could use Bitcoin as a currency. And they had this concept that because the value of Bitcoin had been growing, that was the most important thing, that the value came from it being this so-called store of value, right?
So, yeah, so you came to a point now that I'm not assuming any any foul play from any side, because, I wasn't part of it. But it makes sense if one side is betting on it or trying to manipulate it to become a store of value, that they would push that way. Less people using, but more people getting rich, and also more chance of super rich people using it and actually preventing other people from using it, because, when you have someone that can hold many coins, the chance of other people having something that is scarce diminished proportionally. So
yes.
So we come to this point, which is interesting to me because, again, I come to this as someone looking for alternative currencies for rural areas and farmers and local communities and local economies. Now, if land is solely used as a store of value because land, is finite, and we don't respect that, even if it's finite, part of the land should be used in a way that benefits everyone. We ruin land. We ruin rural areas. And the same thing that's what bothers me a bit with the BTC and BCH, which is if it becomes mainly a store of value, it loses its function. And that's why I sort of was more inclined towards Bitcoin Cash, because what I need is a currency. I don't need that currency to become so expensive that it prevents people from using it. It's the same thing with land. I'm not saying we should take land from people who has land and then give to someone else. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we still have plenty of land, and we should, as groups of people, look at land as it is, which is a territorial base upon which we can have water, food, and organize our societies. So it's actually fundamental, literally and figuratively. Now, if we use BTC or BCH in the same way that rich people are using land today, eventually we're going to have a French Revolution again worldwide.
Yes, maybe so. So basically the way you can think of it is that, like BTC was the small blockers, they're like the descendants, the historical descendants of that, and BCH is like the big blockers, right? And the dispute, maybe if you boil it down, is this idea that everyone agrees on both sides that money needs to be a store of value. Obviously, you can't have all your money directly draining away. That's just inflation. That's bad. But it also needs to be transactable. It also needs to be a medium of exchange. So to the big blockers, the medium of exchange is the number one priority thing. And the reason why is very obvious, because the only value in money is to trade it to somebody else. If I have $10 billion, but it's frozen in my bank account and I never spend it and I die, it was worthless, right? You can't eat it, you can't live in it, you can't do anything with it. The only value you have from money is at the moment when you exchange it to somebody else. And the more people are exchanging it, the more valuable and useful it is. That's why everybody wants money, is because you can trade it easily with everyone else. So that's kind of the idea, that you get the medium of exchange rolling and then it becomes valuable, you get a store of value. Now, the small blocker side, what is now in BTC, is essentially running according to the opposite philosophy. Their idea is that the digital scarcity, like I mentioned before, is the key point. And because it's scarce, it will therefore drive lots of value. And then people will use it as a medium of exchange simply because nobody will accept anything else. Now, that's not what's happening, because we live in a world with options. People don't have to use BTC no matter how scarce it is. They can use BCH, they can use Ethereum, they can use oil, they can use fiat currencies, they can use talcum powder, they can use salt. Literally everything in the world is possible to use as a medium of exchange. So BTC ultimately can't sustain itself in a world where people increasingly prefer to transact in something more efficient and convenient for transactions, which eventually undermines the value. But in the short run, the fact that they got the branding and the ticker symbol and all the clout, the momentum of the Bitcoin brand name, which was of course growing and becoming very famous, drove a lot of value as everybody piled into it. But we'll see in the long run of history whether that's enough to sustain them, and they have their arguments about how they're going to solve those problems. But that's another chapter. Like you said, it's a whole rabbit hole. There's endless little pathways, but that's the concept, really.
Now, okay. I have a few questions following from that. The first one is up until the fork, or up until the
split,
the split, you share the same 21 million coins.
Yes.
But once one group became Bitcoin Cash, did it create another 21 million cash? How does that work with this scarcity?
Yes. So the concept is, yeah, I didn't really explain that well before, but like I said, it's like religions that split over time, right? So you have a religion going one direction, then you have a schism, and it comes to one side and the other side, and they kind of agree to go their separate ways, but they share that fundamental origin. So maybe, you know, the Protestants and the Catholics, they both have the Bible, and then maybe over time they tweak different things, right? But they started at the same point. The same thing happened in this civil war. Ultimately, where after a lot of discussion, negotiations, attempts to reach compromises and so forth, which again, if you take a conspiracy view, were deliberately undermined, but if you take a charitable view, just no solution could be found. Eventually people got to a point of like, right, okay, we just got to have two different solutions. Now, luckily, Bitcoin provides a method for that because ultimately it's just software. So the ledger of transactions, like I said, usually before you can't just copy it because if somebody else can make a copy, but nobody's going to be interested in it because all of the proof of work, all of the energy is going into one copy, and there's sort of a network effect as everybody wants the money that everyone else wants. So it's very hard for you to say, I've created my copy, it's Jeremy's copy, everyone use that. Everyone's going to say, who are you? Like, get lost. But this division was so serious, and there was enough people on both sides that there was the right conditions for the chain to split. So on August 1st of 2017, which will forever be an infamous day in Bitcoin history, the group and after the split, there was 21 million of each, right? So I was a holder of Bitcoin at the time that this happened. So I got, you know, X, I don't know how much, however much Bitcoin I had that much BTC and I had that much BCH. And that happened for everybody across the whole Bitcoin network. They got two different, currencies, but they got the same amount of each. And then, of course, they can then trade on the market. So the split cannot merge back together. Once it's done, it's done. And people can sell one or buy the other, or, you know, in whatever direction. And since that time, if you buy BTC or BCH, you're only buying that side of the currency. So of course, that changed the scarcity in a certain way, because it's like, instead of there being 21 million, there's now 42 million, but not really, because there's only 21 million within a given network, right? I think I explained it to you like this on the Telegram, which is that it's like websites, right? Anybody can make a website, just like anybody can make a copy of Bitcoin, but nobody can make a copy of a specific website like Facebook. If you make a copy of Facebook, even if you download all the code, you make it look identical, and you put it up and you put facebook2.com, it doesn't matter. Why? Because the value is not just in the website. The value is in all the users, the people that are going back there, the company that runs it, the software developers that build everything, right? The branding, the marketing, the trust that people have in it, the setup on the stock exchange, like all the legal lawsuits that they've won, or the patents they have, right? All those things kind of combine to make the actual website, facebook.com, an asset of value. The same thing happens with currencies, right? Anybody can make a copy of Bitcoin, but if you make a copy of Bitcoin, like I said, and it's just you there, there's no value. The value is in other people willing to trade it with you. So the value for BCH comes from now having had 8 years of history, and also, you know, back to the original history of development, you know, technology, community, exchange integrations, promotion, marketing, podcasts like this, explaining to everybody. All those things add up, and there's a lot of people who will accept BCH. So it's a liquid, you know, scarce currency within the bubble of that 21 million. And the same thing is happening on BTC, and the same thing's happening with US dollars and every other currency in the world, right? As people want to accept a given currency more or less, they put more of their energy, like we said, energy is the basis of everything. They put their economic labor into that currency, or they will accept that currency in exchange for their labor. And the more people that are doing that, the more valuable that currency becomes. If that currency has problems, then people stop accepting it, and they prefer to accept, or they sell it to get something else, and that gives value to that currency. And so all the currencies exchanging all the time, whether it's cryptocurrencies or fiat currencies or precious metals or any other resource, the value comes from how many people at that moment in time are demanding that thing for their labor, right? So the scarcity, in a way, you can think of it like, Bitcoin got replicated from 21 million to 42 million because that happened, but the scarcity within each currency is still preserved because there's only 1 million if you're following that branch of the economics, essentially.
Jeremy, I'm sorry, can you hear me fine? Because you're breaking off a little bit for me, because I'm in a rural area and the internet is a bit dodgy, even though it's supposed to be a good one from a supposedly famous guy that I won't name.
Yes.
I had lots of questions actually, but explain. Well, Bitcoin Cash now it's worth like a fraction, or I don't know how much less than Bitcoin.
It's about 200 to 1 right now. Yeah.
However, Bitcoin is going down, whilst Bitcoin Cash was actually going up in a considerably different rate. Can you tie this with what you were just explaining? Because meanwhile, one that's mostly used as a store of value is actually sort of going down. The other one is going up. And then just to add something to this sort of contextual question, Jack Dorsey, who runs Square, recently just made possible for people to transact using Bitcoin using Square, and it was like days after the plunge. And I think it was probably they could have done that in any time, but they chose to do that in a time that would sort of help hold its value. Do you think that's a fair comment as well?
Yes. Okay. So first question first. So BTC and BCH trade on the free market, just like the euro and the dollar go up and down against each other. I mean, they're both going down, but they go down at different rates, The same way BTC and BCH, they trade against each other and they trade against every other currency. Now, the price of something is essentially a price on information, right? Markets price information. They don't price the inherent value of something because value is subjective. So any given person might buy something for $10 and think they were getting a fantastic deal, which somebody else wouldn't even buy for $100, right? So markets are just an aggregate pricing of information. Now, when BTC and BCH split because of all the circumstances, which you can hear about in Who Killed Bitcoin and in Hijacking Bitcoin, or on my site, bitcoincashpodcast.com, you can look up that and find all the relevant history and details of how it all went down. Essentially, the small blockers managed to win the civil war, and so they got the benefit of the brand name and the exchange liquidity and the mining hash rate and the control of the GitHub repository and control of, at the time, important social media, websites, bitcoin.org, stuff like that, right? So for all these reasons, they managed to get sort of an early lead in the marathon, let's say, of becoming a currency used by the entire world. Of course, BTC and BCH are both still very small because hardly anybody is using them to transact day to day out of the 8 billion people, but BCH is the smaller one. So of those two, BTC has had much better price performance in the short term, and it's been significant. But over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, things have started to change a little bit. The rate at which BCH was dropping has slowed down, and now it's even started to go up just a little bit. And that's, in my mind, because the market is beginning to receive better information. Who Killed Bitcoin, Hijacking Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash Podcast, like the BCH community has made a concerted effort to bring a lot of this information that was suppressed to light. And also people are slowly starting to understand all the implications of the technology and various arguments that were made by the big blockers, which maybe at the time they didn't, and they just went with, this is the most popular, it's the number one coin, I'm just going to jump, it seems authoritative, right? So that's something that we're going to see play out in future. Of course, if you ask me, I'm very biased, but I will say BCH is basically turning the ship around, and then it will start accelerating past BTC. But if you ask people from BTC, they will tell you, oh, BCH has basically failed and died and it's never coming back. Look, there's lots of cryptocurrencies that have bad ideas that just die, and that's the end of them, right? BCH, in my mind, is different because of this history and the community that is so committed to it, and also that is so resilient that it has survived this long. But of course, that remains to be seen. You can make your own judgment. Now, as for Jack Dorsey and Square, Jack Dorsey is an interesting guy, but one of the fascinating things was he also has jumped on this train of BTC, and despite the fact that he often proclaims these kind of freedom values, he was also heavily involved in Twitter at the time when they were later revealed to be doing insane amounts of censorship, which, who knows whether he was able to stop that or whether he facilitated it or what was going on. I don't know, but certainly his track record is spotty. In any case, he is a big fan of BTC, and he has been, working to try and improve that and make it usable for payments. And he's made these recent announcements. As far as I know, it's a bit of a lost cause, right? He's trying to make the best of a bad situation, maybe, to put it charitably. I don't think this grand rollout is going to go that well. For instance, a few years ago, Tesla got very interested in Bitcoin, and they did famously, they bought some Bitcoin, they made an announcement, they had it on their website that people could pay for it. But then, I don't know, 6 months or 12 months later, this would have been from about mid 2021 to 2022. Eventually, and Dogecoin as well, right? But eventually they kind of quietly sunset that. They stopped accepting it, or they didn't take payments as much. They sort of sold off a little bit of their holdings. They haven't been promoting it. They haven't been making a big deal out of it. Why? It's because ultimately a currency needs to work. A business needs a currency to work. And even if they can get some temporary boost out of announcing it and make a big deal out of it, at the end of the day, if they're dealing with support tickets of people that are confused and why is this broken and why is it so expensive, and eventually they just say this is not working. And I think the same thing is going to happen with Jack Dorsey and his Square endeavors on BTC, but that's of course just my opinion. We'll see how it goes in practice.
Another question from an ignorant person in these matters. How different Square is when it uses Bitcoin from all those Lightning wallets, and I think it's a good segue to talk about self-custody and
yes.
all the other things.
Yes. So I'm also not, an expert. I haven't used any of these Square terminals. I haven't dug into it. But essentially, because BTC, like I said, their priority was on the store of value side and not on the medium of exchange side of things, they have not done in general a very good job of facilitating medium of exchange payments. That's why, despite being $100,000 in this global sensation, most people anywhere in the world, there's literally nowhere in the world where you can go that people are just transacting Bitcoin at shops, at restaurants, at McDonald's every single day. It doesn't exist nowhere in the world. And that really should tell you something. Is because as much as it has been able to accrue value and capital and hype, it has not been functioning as a smooth peer-to-peer economy, basically. So they have a variety of different workarounds, which, again, I'm always trying to be fair in my reporting. From my point of view, are basically scams and distractions, but from their point of view are technical innovations and solutions to these things. Famously, one of them was the Lightning Network, which was a big topic during the block size war, and that's, again, it's all mentioned in Who Killed Bitcoin and Hijacking Bitcoin, and on my site you can read more about all the specifics. But basically, the small blockers were like, this Lightning Network is going to fix our medium of exchange. Like, we've got the store of value part sorted, now we just need to fix the medium of exchange part. Now, that didn't really work out, and many years later they've increasingly either gone one of two ways. One is they've started to agree, okay, we were a bit hasty about this, it wasn't going to work, ever, maybe, like, it's more complicated than we realize, and a lot of various excuses. or two, they've started making compromises which they then sort of sweep under the rug. The whole point of the scarcity is that you need to hold your own Bitcoins, right? Once upon a time, people held gold in their own home, but the reason we ended up with fiat currency is because slowly people thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be convenient if I had paper that was much lighter and easier to carry? It was also easier to exchange with people. So what I'll do is I'll put my gold in a bank and they will give me a note, a claim on that gold, and then I can trade that. And so that was more convenient and easier. So people moved over to it. And soon enough, the governments, like in 1971, the US closed the gold window. They said, okay, you can't trade in your paper notes for gold. And now you're just trading paper. So people just sort of got rug pulled, as they say in crypto. They got scammed where initially the people had the gold, and then afterwards the banks had the gold, and the people just had the useless paper notes claimed on it. So then the government could just instantly print paper when they couldn't instantly print gold, right? But the same thing is kind of happening with BTC, where once upon a time, and still in BCH, everybody is able to transact directly with the Bitcoin that they control and hold, what's called self-custody. But increasingly, especially on the BTC side, people are slowly being stepped into this, well, you can use this Lightning Network instead. And if you dig into it, then actually a lot of the time, some of the time, it's self-custodial, but there's a lot of workarounds, there's a lot of problems, it's very expensive, it's very hard to manage. Or to paper over that, they just make it custodial, in which case you are not holding the Bitcoin, somebody else is holding the Bitcoin, and you're having maybe at best a claim on the Bitcoin, which is exactly like the fiat paper and the gold. The gold is being held in a centralized vault, and as time goes on, eventually it will get to a point where the average person, like the BTC is already used by only a tiny minority of the world's population, 0.001% or whatever. And even at that scale, it can't facilitate people trading directly. They've already had to put the middlemen back into it, and that problem is only going to get worse, of course. As the more people get into it, they're less educated, they don't understand everything involved, they just copy, the tools and the systems that are working for everyone else, and you've reintroduced that. That's basically what the Lightning Network is. You have these Lightning Network hubs, and you have companies that are called LSPs, Lightning Service Providers, or liquidity service providers maybe, and that they are basically like the banks being reintroduced. It's somebody that facilitates the transaction between you and somebody else. It's not just directly on the Bitcoin network anymore.
But how they can justify this if the first line of the white paper is a peer-to-peer form of digital currency?
Good question. And there's a couple of different answers to that. The one reason is that a lot of them haven't read the Bitcoin white paper. You would actually be shocked if you ask around in the BTC community or even in the cryptocurrency community in general, how many of them have never read the Bitcoin white paper. You maybe went back and did your research, but a lot of people, they just literally have never done that. They've heard on podcasts or they've heard what this kind of distorted view of history, and they just accept it as fact, right? So they just kind of go, okay, well, maybe, Bitcoin is quote unquote digital gold, right? You've heard that. That's this whole narrative. Like, they don't know that it's peer-to-peer cash. They think that it's digital gold because that's what they've been told by the media and by famous BTC influencers and everything else. So that's one reason that they don't have a cognitive dissonance about that. And then the second thing you come across, which is for people who maybe have read the white paper, is they kind of move the goalposts. They will say, and again, it comes back to that medium of exchange store of value thing. They will say, well, Bitcoin is digital gold, so it's right now it's a store of value, but in the future, it will become a medium of exchange. Like I said, they have the premise that because it's scarce, everyone will have to hold Bitcoin. And then once people are holding Bitcoin and all the other currencies have inflated away to worthless, they will somehow or another find a way to make it workable as a medium of exchange. So in their mind, the problems that they're having with Lightning Network and all that are not fundamental to their approach. It's just something like we'll resolve it with time. As technology goes on, as we do more software development, as more people get educated, somehow or another we'll work our way back to having a peer-to-peer currency. Now, the BCH side, of course, thinks that's nonsense. Like, if it doesn't work now, why would it work in the future? That's complete nonsense. But to be fair, the BCH community has the same approach, just on a different topic. Like I said, where we said, okay, well, the BCH price is down and the people are less educated about it and there's all this confusion and the ratio is low. But in the future, as we gain traction, that will be fixed, right? So it's kind of like we have a cultural problem and they have a technical problem. And the question is who solves which side first, or which is easier to fix, I guess.
Again, you talk about a cultural side and a technological side, and I have a few thoughts that I would like to share. Not really a question. It bothers me that most people in this realm, they have a faith in technology. It's not factual, it's faith. We don't have the evidence that will be forever going up in technological advancements. We have failed before. We have many cycles of civilization that failed before. We just one version of it. We probably have very advanced civilizations before, and it's just our time now. One thing that causes that for me is actually this thinking that technology will solve everything, when at the end or deep at the bottom, what we have, it's a ethical dilemma. Now, when you say that people will eventually use it when it becomes too valued, we are, again, I'm a sociologist, so I read in ecology, I read in anthropology, in archaeology, and most people in the Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash don't. So what happens to small areas when empires shrink? Isn't that they go for the most valued coin? They create very clever ways to uphold what is essential. They start trading labor, they start trading food, and it's actually, there are very strong scientific arguments from archaeology and anthropology that Adam Smith was wrong in his theory that the barter was not efficient and the money was very efficient. It's we have enough evidence today to at least put that in check. Like, maybe it was not that simple. And these things interest me, and I still think a peer-to-peer currency is needed because, again, in local areas, if you still have the internet, and you can cater for most of your needs with the help of your neighbors and from the land, you're still going to need cash. Now, maybe you're going to need less cash because your life has been simplified in terms of economic activity. It doesn't mean that it will be simplified in philosophical ways, in spiritual ways. It just means that the economy will shrink. Most Westerners think that if the economy shrinks, our lives shrink. The meaning of our lives shrink. That's just a Western bias. Now, the reason I'm making this comment is when I was doing my research, people who use the wallet, or people who are in the Lightning Network, like you said, they were not very open-minded, and I was actually surprised because I was just making questions. I was just asking questions. Look, I want to understand this. I want to know if this is a tool that I can use in rural areas to create security, to create alternatives, parallel infrastructures for people when things go bad. That's all. That's my main interest, because I see things in a different. I see this in a different way. Most people who are now deep, entrenched in rich countries in technology, they will have to learn how to simplify their lives, because we don't have enough energy to keep going upwards like we have been in the past. Now, it's going to be a very steep learning curve for people to understand that they cannot use money to solve all of their problems. And we do have, again, evidence that this happened. There's a guy, he studies, he became known for studying the collapse of the Soviet Union. His name is Dmitry Orlov. He wrote a book. It's called 5 Stages of Collapse. and what he tells in that book is that money became less valued as people wanted things that they could produce and make. You know, like a guy that could make vodka, people who can, you know, farmers, hunters. These were very valued people. They were more valued in a very dire situation than money itself, because they were the resource. Like you were just saying a few minutes ago. So what becomes the resource changes, and the function of the currency becomes important just as that, as a currency, as a way to trade. And I think people are getting this wrong, because money hasn't value in itself. Money has its value in some resource that is amongst people. This resource might be information, food, services, whatever. So in saying that, what I'm getting at is Bitcoin Cash, because it's way cheaper to use as a peer-to-peer, might be actually easier to be adopted in rural areas, in poor countries, and you know, people that are being persecuted by governments, dictatorships, or whatever. Because the entry level for Bitcoin is too high. So I think we have a point there for Bitcoin Cash, and then the question that follows is this: do you see a way of having local currencies instead of being attached to central banks? The people issuing money, just like banks do, but it's a local currency, and instead of having that attached to the fiat money, we attach that to Bitcoin Cash. Is that a scenario that you can see?
Yes, well, not only that I can see it, but it's already starting to happen a little bit. Like you are talking about, money is sort of an emergent property of a group of people, and when the money is not, or when society at a large scale is not working, things do collapse more down to barter, because people need to get closer to the actual valuable thing. Like we've said, the money is only valuable for what you can trade it for, and barter is inefficient, but it's not that inefficient at a small scale. At a small scale, like in a small town or in a small community where people know each other, you already have a lot of trust, and you also have a lot of verifiability. You know, you can see, okay, this guy is producing the vodka or the eggs that I'm getting from him. Whereas if you're in a city and somebody's in a farm somewhere else, you don't know that guy. You just know that it's in the supermarket. You know, you don't know where it came from, right? So at a small scale, barter is quite efficient. And in a failing currency regime, of course, people will look for alternatives, and that will collapse back primarily to their local community. Now, the BCH community is aware of this. Part of the reason we've had a problem is because, yes, you're right, BCH is more suited for, sort of developing regions of the world. That's why it's popular in like Argentina, in the Philippines, in Nigeria. These places have quite strong BCH hubs, but they have less strong hubs in like America and Europe. But so, part of the problem is that the developing countries might be more suited, but all the money is in the rich countries, of course, and you need the money to then build the infrastructure and technology. So it's about finding a synergy between those two things. But as regards people making small community currencies, yeah, I think that's definitely going to happen. And right now, the BCH community is actually working a lot on that. Again, this is, jumping the ball forward a lot, but in 2023, the Bitcoin Cash community added a network upgrade called Cash Tokens, which let you create tokens and send them around on the Bitcoin Cash network in the way that people might be familiar with it on Ethereum or on other networks. Now, the BTC community, that's a long story, but for various reasons, they kind of dislike that and they don't have that technology, but the BCH community does. So you're able to create currencies that are either free floating, as according to a small community, or that are backed by BCH. So there's a stable coin called Moria USD, which essentially gives you the ability to track it in US dollars, but the value is backed on chain by collateral provided in BCH. So you know that when you want to cash it out for $1, you can actually get $1 because there's BCH locked to provide that value. But you can also just issue a community currency. There's one called Orlando, which I will send you a link afterwards. It's a project, I believe it's in Switzerland, by a community that have this exact idea of what you're saying, and they want to use their own community currency. And so they created a token for their community on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, and then they can send it around amongst themselves. And of course, they can also swap it in and out of BCH. But of course, you need all the wallets, you need the developers, you need the tooling, all this stuff to support it. So the BCH community is actively trying to create a system so that anybody who wants to do that kind of project can do it, and all the technology already interoperates without them having to do anything, basically.
There's a guy in, I think he's from England. His name is Rob Hopkins. He wrote a book called Transition Towns. He studied alternative currencies, and he talks. He's got a phrase that's pretty interesting for our conversation. He says, in a time of depression, in a very serious crisis, it's not the goods and services that go lacking. It's only the medium of exchange.
That's trust, really, is what goes lacking. And then the currency is just a sort of form of commoditized, quantified trust. Yeah.
And then he goes about documenting places after the Second World War that started issuing their own local currencies, and they actually thrived really fast. They recovered really fast. But what happens, and this is not what he says, this is my reading of it, but it's pretty accurate, which is what happens afterwards is that once they recover fast than the larger economy, because they protagonize, they guided their own recovery, and they have social capital. They sometimes have natural capital, ecology, a good land base to farm, that sort of stuff. So they recover much faster than the larger economy. But what happens is, as soon as the country recovers, the central bank comes and smashes them again.
Yes.
And this happened many times. So my question, going even deeper, is like, you're talking about tokens, and that's fine, that's already useful, but can we actually use a physical currency and then have a point of exchange that we use Bitcoin Cash, for example?
Yeah, of course. Well, there's two or three answers to that. So the first one is that like fiat currency, like I said before, was originally the idea that somebody held gold and then somebody issued paper notes, and that system actually worked fine. That's actually a fine system as long as the person who holds the gold is trustworthy. So similar to barter, that can work quite effectively at a small scale. If your town mayor is the guy who holds all the gold, then you can have a local currency, because if he is a scammer and he runs off, everyone knows who is the mayor and they can all go and lynch him, So it's definitely possible to still do that in BCH, today. Like, of course, if you want to issue virtual tokens representing a physical asset of some kind, it could be gold or it could be something else, you're definitely welcome to do that. The only problem is you might run into is then what if the person who holds the gold has a problem? But at a small scale, maybe there are solutions to that. At a large scale, much more difficult.
I'm trying to stay coherent to the use for this matter, for the Bitcoin Cash. What I'm trying to come up with is different. Let me just backtrack a bit. First, we had the gold standard. Once they actually scammed everyone, then we had the fiat currency. So just to make a separation here for people to understand. So a note of a $10 note meant that you could go to a bank and get $10 in gold. That was the gold standard. Now, when we start using fiat money, that was down the drain, because the U.S. government pretty much defaulted everyone. They pretty much used their power to say, well, we're not going to pay you, and fuck off. Basically, was that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they defaulted. Yeah, exactly. They said, we're not going to pay up on our debt, essentially, which is to pay out gold to all these claims. And yeah, exactly. They just said, piss off.
we then started using your money that, to use economic terms, is decoupled from reality. It's decoupled.
Yes. Yes.
Now, that's my point, that I didn't quite agree with you, that I think we need energy in order for a currency to uphold its value, because for it to work as a symbol of energy, that value needs to be materialized in work, and I don't think we're gonna be able to do that. But that's my opinion. Aside, doesn't matter for this conversation. What I'm trying to say is this: I don't want to go back to. I don't want to replicate a currency mindset with Bitcoin Cash. What I'm trying to say is, let's paint a picture. We are in rural areas, unreliable internet, and we need people to be able to exchange, and then we go and print like a local currency. Doesn't matter. Let's say it's farming BCH. It's a physical token. We're going to issue farming BCH, and then we're going to run to the local area and say, guys, look, we have these notes that we can use if you anchor your money. If you put your money into the BCH network, we can use these notes. And basically what we could do, that's what I'm trying to come up with. I'm not sure it's possible. Is that eventually No, here you go.
Well, this is I said there was two things. I was coming on to that. So the first one is you can issue the virtual tokens, or the second thing is you're talking about a way to make a physical representation of BCH. And yes, we also have that. There's a project called stamps.cash. You can look it up, and it's a guy called Steve Thurmond and some devs that work with him. And what they've made, I wish I had one right here to show you, but it's like a business card. And what it has is a website link that you can go to if you're interested, and it has a QR code, and it folds over, right? So that you could hand this around, and it can say on it $1 of BCH or $10 of BCH or 1 BCH or however much you want, and you can physically hand that around to people exactly like you would with a cash bill. Now, there's one little catch, which is the QR code is a key to some BCH. So then if you flip open the panel, you can use your wallet and you can scan it and you can grab the money out of that, right? So it's only valuable as long as nobody has done that, right? If somebody has done that, then it's just back to cardboard, right? But while it's not being scanned, then you can hand around the BCH physically in an environment like you're saying. So with some education, if you had a small group of people that were willing to semi-trust each other, then they could trade that, like, let's say at a farmer's market or something like that. And then when they get home, they have their internet, they can just scan it to make sure all the money is still there. Of course, they would need to be able to kind of see, like, if somebody was handing out fake ones that they had already taken the money out of, they would need to be able to track down and find, okay, you are the guy who scammed me. But at a small scale, that could definitely work. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to study and design solutions like this. France was famously created the tourism routes. So in France, small farmers were going broke, and then sometime late 80s and 90s, some local economists, they came up with the notion of routes. So let's do the natural wine route. Let's do the brie cheese route, whatever. What happened was that they had a revival of local currencies. That part of the story is not told. They just say that the economy started to blossom again. But before the economy sort of came back to the mainstream, some of these tourism routes, they had their own currency. And I find that very interesting, because one of the things that I'm interested in is the possibility of securing local economies in major crashes. So we have advantages already, because if we are using Bitcoin Cash, we're not going to be that affected. Now, there's another possibility, and that one is a plus. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. Like you're saying, it's a bet, which is if we issue local money attached to Bitcoin Cash, it will be valuing more. As far as we don't have like a world crash, it will be going up faster than any sort of available investment scheme for regular people. So you have a currency that you don't even need to put in a saving account because it's already gaining in value just because you're using it. The only thing that I need to work around is that we need to create some of these routes again, and then people come to a main desk or to a reception or whatever and said, look, you guys need to exchange your dollar or your Brazilian real to our Bitcoin Cash. Why? Well, because we work this way here in this region, and afterwards when you go back, if you want, you can sell it back, or you can just go and use BCH or whatever. Now, in doing that, I can make people trade amongst themselves in a region, and I can actually make people come from outside of that region and put money in and put trust in. And as far as the economy is still surviving, because people did that, they're actually gaining, they're actually increasing their store of value instead of losing. And I'm saying that because I'll just give you an example. Again, rural areas. I have quoted for a roof, insulated roof panels in the past 4 years, 3 times for different buildings that I had to work with. The inflation is nearly, it's between 30 and 40% in different companies, depending on who you get the quote from, okay? The official story from the government, it's below 10%. It's bullshit. So in reality, we are losing our money, or the value that the money has, much, much faster than the government is acknowledging. But it doesn't matter for rich people because they don't use money. They have land, gold. Some of them are still buying dollars or Bitcoin. So that's the tricky situation that regular folks are in that I would like to circumvent. We need local economies, but that doesn't mean that we need to create a coin or a currency that is from scratch. We might as well just use Bitcoin Cash because it's working, because it's peer-to-peer, because it's in self-custody. And then we work around the lack of internet or that sort of stuff in local areas. Do you see my vision?
Well, yeah, I think you've basically hit on the right thing. This is what BCH is all about. After this call, I'll link you up with the Orlando stuff. You can see what they're doing there. And like I said, these hotspots in BCH is exactly what's happening in Argentina, in the Philippines, in Townsville, in Australia. That's what all these different communities are trying to do to attack this exact same problem in the exact same way, right? They have the exact same need, which is the government, one way or another, is screwing with them. They need a way out of that, and they found the BCH community. And of course, they can issue their own tokens, but a lot of the time they basically just prefer to use BCH because then you've got the benefit of not being screwed around by the local currency, but you also have the infrastructure that the whole BCH community is providing, right? It's a huge advantage. So of course, it's more, that's why then you can have the developers here and the developers there. You can have tooling produced by some people and not by other people, etc. And just as a whole, like you said, that's the whole point of a fixed supply currency is there's only 21 million BCH. So you can think of the BCH as kind of like a digital currency or a digital community, which your community would then sit within. And there's all other communities as well too, right? And of course, the more everyone uses BCH, the more everyone benefits. That's the whole growth in the economy goes back into the holders of the economy rather than being printed away by the government. That's the Bitcoin concept.
Well, Jeremy, I think you helped me a lot because I need to understand more. I'll be happy to hook up with these guys and the developers and the South American hubs that you point me to, and try and talk to them to discuss these ideas, because we need insurances. We need ways to prepare for the absence of government or the authoritarian use of power, The two instances are very risky for regular folks in rural areas. One is if the government withdraws really fast, people, because they've been trained to be dependent, they'll be lost. The other way around is also true. If you are becoming a problem for the government because you are in an area that is actually working around economic issues and becoming somehow interdependent and somehow self-sufficient, they will come and crush you. So in these two instances, we need insurances that we can actually keep trading with each other and circumvent, authoritarian regimes and the lack of regimes in some areas. Because people talk a lot about authoritarian regimes, but they don't talk about the fact that rural people have been trained for the past century to trust governments. And when the government's not there, people who used to be self-reliant are left behind. So you don't have to be 100% right in one of the prospections that you do, but we do have to build resiliency and insurances. So I think BCH is very sharp for that.
Yes, we're just trying to provide an alternative. That's ultimately what it is. And it's why I believe so strongly in what I advocate for. The government, the fiat currencies are, like Mao said, to misquote him, enforced at the point of a gun, right? If you don't want to use your fiat currency, that's where you run into problems. That's where the government comes and why aren't you paying these taxes? They're forcing all the businesses to accept them. They put all these fees and controls on financial markets and so forth, which affects people. Places like Brazil more than anywhere, really. And BCH is the exact opposite. If anybody doesn't want to use BCH, that's fine, no problem. Like you don't want to use it, you don't want to use it. You're not convinced. When it comes like when you're saying about Yanis Varoufakis, it's the solution to a problem we don't have. What he meant is it's a problem to a solution. It's a solution to a problem I don't have. Actually, that's that simple. He is not affected by that, so he doesn't think it's a problem. But clearly other people do. That's why Bitcoin exists. That's why it's a thriving community. That's why all this cryptocurrency stuff is going on. Yes, there's a lot of, scams and grifting, of course, as well, just like there is with government currencies. But the reason it exists and the reason it keeps thriving and growing is because a lot of people do have those problems. And the more people that get involved, then the more, economic energy there is to draw other people in, and it just keeps growing like that until somebody else discovers, oh, wait, now suddenly I'm the one having my currency inflated away. I'm the one who's having a Canadian trucker rally shut down on me. I'm the one who's being, added capital controls to moving money that I never thought it would happen to me, but suddenly it is. And then that's when it clicks like, oh, this is what these guys have been telling me for the last 10 years, but I just didn't have that problem. But once you do have that problem, the same as you, same as me, same as anyone, you look into it and you're like, oh, thank goodness all these guys are already here working on providing a solution, because it's not that easy to spin up overnight,
Yeah, that's my main point, which is the network already exists. There's no need to come up with a very... I can have a local currency that is very tied to local culture, but that doesn't have to be tied to the central bank. That's the main thing.
Yes.
Because most of the time when people, when they issue a local currency, the government comes on top of them and said, you can't do that. You need to do this and that or whatever. So we do have microcredits and we do have local currencies in Brazil. They're quite successful, but they are tied to a fiduciary, like a fiat money system with the central bank. So what I'm trying to do is create a local currency that works physically, but instead it taps into a network that already exists, that is peer-to-peer, and that's censorship resistant. We need that. That's insurance we need for, for very... I can see a few scenarios in the near future in which we're going to need that, especially farmers, because we've been crushed. Like you said, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in many places, the amalgamation, the speed in which corporations are taking farmland and using government to create policies that push small farmers out of business just to acquire their land is amazing. And people can't see that. And it should be, from the top to the bottom, a national threat, a local government threat, and we as people that want to be free, we should be looking at it as a threat to our freedom, because we need food 3 times a day at least. So the government won't provide high quality food from now on. It's already happening in Brazil. We have the 30th climate summit in Brazil happening now. During the smokescreen of the event, the government just issued an authorization for another 30 chemicals to be used in agriculture. Brazil has the highest usage of petrochemicals in agriculture in the whole world, and it's still increasing. So, what freedom do you have if you're stacked of, it doesn't matter if it's Bitcoin, but if you're full of it, but you can't access real food, if you can't access real people. So I think we need to, like you said before, we have a technological challenge, but we have a cultural challenge as well. But I think 2 ends are not quite grasping, because the technological thinks everything's going to be solved by technology and will not. And in the cultural side, people think that maybe these young guys working with Bitcoin are just crazy people because because you can't eat zeros and ones. You can't eat that. Yeah, you can't eat that, but you can use that to trade, and that's the point that they're missing. So we have like a blind spots in both sides that I'm starting to, to bridge these gaps. I would be happy if you point me to these guys. I want to talk to them, the developers and the Orlando guy. What's his name?
Well, it's not a game. That's the name of the currency that they have, Orlando. I'll send you it afterwards. I'm also not, hugely involved with that, but
yep.
Orlando, I think it's maybe it's a Swedish word, or a Swiss word or something like that, but maybe that's the name of their town. I don't know, but they're doing some kind of local currency initiative with that. There's the BCH Argentina guys they'll link you up with. I know one guy who's big on BCH in Brazil who can refer you to whatever is going on locally there, and probably Portuguese resources and different things like that. I'll show you stamps, which is people doing what you said, making the physical notes that people can hand around locally and so forth. Like, we already have a lot of what you're looking for. You just need to get pointed in the right direction, and I think you sound exactly like you're in the right mentality for the BCH community. I think you'll be like, wow, this is great.
Well, Jeremy, it was a pleasure, man. It's not that often we encounter support and people willing to help and explain and be open-minded about questions. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Oh, very glad to be here. And of course, people can check out bitcoincashpodcast.com if they want to hear more about all of this and everything related to that. Like you said, it's a big rabbit hole. Once you get into it, you can try Selene Wallet, which is my wallet that you can use to transact BCH. You can try Blaze, which is a hackathon we're running at the moment, and we have Bliss, a conference that we run. That's what these are about, but that's a story for another time. So there's a whole world going on, and hopefully, at least for some of your listeners and for you, maybe this was the first step in the route.
If you send me all those links, I'll put them in the description notes for the show. Jeremy, thank you very much, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.